Good day, friends. I hope this message finds you well. I hope exciting things are going on for you poetically and life-wise in general. Today I want to spend some time talking about the material from the books. We're going to talk about some things from the Mary Oliver book, including different types of poems and styles, and we're going to talk about our feelings, as Ted Kooser is recommending. Before we get into that, I wanted to spend a minute talking about something I posted last night. Last night I asked you to provide sometimes I gave you 2 class periods we'll be meeting in the near future, next week and then 2 weeks from that, and I'm just asking for people to sign up for workshops. I've got Arlene up for next time, which is awesome. Thanks, Arlene. And then I've got a couple of more spots available, and then I've got a few spots the 2 weeks after that. What I asked for in the message is that that we would defer those spots, obviously, to people who have not yet workshopped, but I expect that we'll be able to workshop more than one piece from anybody who wants to. That shouldn't be a problem. So if you want to send me something, even though you already have, you can send it to me. I just might hold on to it for a bit just to see if anybody else comes, and if I don't get any more, we'll get it in. You'll have to. It's part of the grade, is that we're going to workshop things. So let's make sure that we do. And I don't want to get on you. I know who hasn't workshopped, obviously. But let's just make this easy for all of us and just volunteer something. And then life is easy and smooth and everything's great. So if you've got something, you'll be able to get me by tomorrow or Tuesday. Or tomorrow or Thursday, I'm sorry. Please send it my way. If it feels like you'd want to have that extra week or so and you want to do it the following time, that's great too. I just want to make sure we've got everybody covered. If it turns out that we don't have enough for 1 week, we'll make do with that too. But that's the main thing I'm going for. I mentioned this before, but the Nighthawk Review is still accepting submissions through the end of this week. Please send some stuff in. There are a couple of you in class who've already done it. I won't name names, but you know who you are, and I know who you are, and I thank you for it. So if you are interested in that, and you should be, because this is a great opportunity, as Sam and I discussed last time, please make sure that you do. We're also going to have a little reading celebration type thing in Price at the end toward the end of the semester once we get the thing published. More information on that will come as we follow, and everybody's invited, obviously. If you're somebody who submitted stuff, you'll get to know in the next couple weeks if work has been accepted, and then you will be, of course, invited to come and read with us. If you're all the way out in Logan or Tooele or wherever, that might be a little bit harder, but who knows? Maybe you'll still be able to make it. So those of you in Price who have not yet submitted, and again, you know who you are, and I know who you are, let's make sure you do too, because it's easier to get to our celebration. And again, even if you don't get work accepted in the magazine, it's a great experience just to try, just to get started on this. And as the semester goes on, I'll try to spend some time talking about the art and craft of submitting work. That there is definitely a lot that goes into trying to become an actively publishing poet, and I will have some experience in talking about that, so I'll do my best to give you a heads up on how all that goes. So yeah, sign up for workshops if you haven't already. Let's make sure that we get stuff sent to the Nighthawk Review if we haven't already. And let's talk about Mary Oliver, because we haven't already. And what we have in the Mary Oliver for today starts off with talking about diction, tone, and voice. And then she will spend some time talking about different types of poems and the importance of that. So get your textbooks out. Let's turn to page 76, where we talk about diction, tone, and voice. Before we get into Mary Oliver, though, as you're getting your book together, which you probably already have, I had on the syllabus for a little bit earlier than where we are right now that I wanted to spend some time talking about Mary Oliver's poems. Actually, I had that on the agenda for last week. We didn't do it. What I'd like for you to do is get the selected Mary Oliver books, bring them next week, and in anticipation of class next time, I want you to go through and just read through it. Don't read the whole book. I recommend you should read the whole book. But what I'd like you to do at this point is read through and find poems that strike your fancy for whatever reason. And we'll spend some time in class going through some of the poems and talking about what poems we were drawn to and why. I think it's a great exercise to just sort of enjoy the work and read it out loud together and talk about what the work is doing. And so next time, make sure that you've read through. You read the book how you want to. Like I said, I'm not requiring the whole thing at this point. I'm asking you to kind of jump in and read several selections. Maybe find titles that draw your attention. We spent a lot of time talking about titles lately. Maybe reading first lines and finding emotions that grab you. But just read through and see what work of Oliver's feels like it matters to you for whatever reason. And bring the book in and we'll talk about it in class next time. And let's talk about diction, tone, and voice. These are all really important things to think about. And she explains them, as Oliver does, complicated ideas and forms in pretty accessible ways. And one of the first things she discusses here is diction in the contemporary poem. And what she describes as diction is word choice. It's the language that we're using for the moment. And so when we talk about having good diction in a poem, what that means is that we are using the right word at the right time. She also talks about tone, which is the overall effect of the diction in a piece of writing, as she says on 76. This just kind of means the way everything is fit together and the sort of tone that's set by the poem. In film, we call it the mise en scène, right? The way it looks, the way it feels. In a poem, it's the way it feels. That's the tone. Some poems have tones that are upbeat, and some have tones that are dark. What is it that the imagery and the language and everything else is contributing to the poem? That's the tone. And then there's the voice. And that's used to describe the personality of the speaker behind the poem. She says that it's used to identify the agency or agent who is speaking through the poem. And I like that word agency because it makes me think of an urgency, that there's an agency to the poem, a necessity to the poem, and the voice is kind of providing that. Also, we know that the voice or the speaker of the poem is often called the persona, which means sometimes we very consciously have a speaker that is not us, that's speaking for the poem. I think we should always think about the speaker of the poem, the voice of the poem, the persona of the poem, as being separate from us, even when it is very much a stand-in for us. Because I think that makes it easier for the reader to kind of comprehend things. We've talked about it in class, that we don't want to say, you did this in the poem and you did this, when I could say, well, the speaker did. Which is helpful even when it is a poem that has a lot of personal aspects to it, which is something we're going to talk about when we get into the lyric poem, which is something that is usually very, very personal. So for the contemporary poem is something separate from what we've often read in our lit classes. Now, obviously, in some of our lit classes, we have read stuff that's more recent, that's late 20, early 21st century work. But when we're talking about things here, a lot of the examples she's given are work that's not contemporary. A lot of examples we've given were from Keats and Frost and wonderful poets that sometimes we have professed our affection for in class and sometimes named our children's middle names after. So these are poets that matter very greatly to us. But when we talk about the contemporary poem, sometimes the styles and the approaches are just a little bit different. On 77, that third paragraph, she tells us, much of contemporary poetry, though by no means all of it, is written in a diction. Remember, that is the word choice. Those are the styles of words that are chosen for the appropriate poem. It is written in a diction that almost belies that it was formally composed. The general tone is one of natural and friendly intimacy. The language is not noticeably different than that of ordinary language. You find words that are neither pretentious nor especially formal. They try to make the poem clear and accessible. Now, this is true in Oliver's work, I think, to a degree, too, and we'll learn more about that when we dig into it a little bit more for next week. But there's accessible language. The diction is not always something complicated. Now, this isn't true of everybody. There are a few contemporary poets, a few very, very good ones, who have language that is not necessarily accessible. The diction of the poem is something that is a little bit difficult to get into. Jorie Graham is a poet that comes to mind. Jorie Graham is a wonderful writer who I've spent a lot of time reading and studying, but her poems are not easy. Her poems are not written in that language of natural and friendly intimacy. There's something that is fractured and detached about it, so I don't feel like it's a friend speaking to me, though there certainly is that urgency behind it. But a lot of the poems that we're going to encounter are going to have that comfort to them. I think we've already read several poems that have that. The mood that develops between you and such a poem is confidence, even intimacy. You feel that the poems may have been written to you. They are not unlike letters you may have received from a good friend. I think that there's something that is positive about this. This isn't the case with every poem. You know this by this point in the semester. When we talk about a certain aspect of a poem, if we talk about one trait that a poem has, that's something that is good for that particular poem, but isn't necessarily going to exist in every other poem. But she provides a poem by Lucille Clifton on 78, and I'm going to read it. It's called I Am Accused of Tending to the Past. You see on this poem, the title is in quotes. Basically what that means here is that the title is just the first line. This is just, the first line is just easing in. We don't actually have a title per se, so we're just using that. I am accused of tending to the past as if I made it, as if I sculpted it with my own hands. I did not. The past was waiting for me when I came, a monstrous unnamed baby, and I looked with my mother's itch, took it to breast and named it history. She is more human now, learning language every day, remembering faces, names, and dates. When she is strong enough to travel on her own, beware, she will. Can't you see as we read that there's something very accessible about the language? There aren't necessarily words here that are purposefully throwing us out, which occasionally we encounter in contemporary poems. There's something is comfortable about it. She's keeping everything very informal in a way. I am accused of tending to the past as if I made it. That the line break is interesting on past, but the line itself is pretty conversational in a lot of ways. The lowercase i's all the way through it, obviously we do not have a standardized capitalization at all. We've got words that begin sentences that are starting with lowercase letters. We've got i's that are starting with lowercase letters. I hope those of us who are very dedicated to the cause of consistent punctuation and grammar are okay with Lucille Clifton's poem. Why is she doing it? Why does she do that? It feels like part of it is because when we do get that capitalized word, it's history on its own line, no less. It emphasizes it. But it also is playing up this sort of casual nature. I'm not worried about rules. I'm just talking to you. And then when something does happen and we do capitalize it, it really jumps. It matters. It kind of brings things to mind a little bit more. So in 79, she says, there exists a definite sense of person. This is the first full paragraph. A perfectly knowable person behind a poem. In truth, it often seems that part of the poem's raison d'etre is precisely to give us information about the writer, whether or not these facts are actual, even sometimes to tell the reader's most intimate details of the writer's life. There's the illusion of intimacy that comes from a lot of these types of poems. This is especially going to be true in what we're going to call the lyric poem, as we're going to talk about it later. That there's this intimacy, the single focus and intimacy that's driving it through, that is going to make us feel very connected to the poem, makes us feel like there's an intimacy that's being created, a vulnerability by the poem. There are many poets who wrote in this way in the 20th century, the most famous of them, I think, being Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell also, but they're considered to be confessional poets. And what that means in a very clunky way is these are poets that gave a lot of themselves on the page, even when it wasn't fully accurate. Plath is probably a poet that we know. Reading Plath's work, it's hard not to think of her biography. Plath was a tragic figure who ultimately committed suicide and was a poet who spoke often of her challenges with the world in her work. She's a brilliant poet, much better than we often think. I think so often with Plath, her biography ends up taking over the poems. And when you look at the poems, you can see this real humanity, but also this real strong sense of rhythm and meter. And this is just a great poet. And I remember once being in a workshop in grad school, or a class in grad school, and there was another person in the class that was saying that every poem was a suicide note. And she wanted to read every poem just strictly from the perspective of the biography. And I felt that this was not a good way of looking at the work, and I said so, and things got a little tense, but it's fine. But what I think we're getting at is that what was amazing about her work is that there was this intimacy, that it felt personal, because it was. But even there were times within her work that there were levels of formality that were kind of presenting a block between her and what was being said. So it's important for us to remember that there's an intimate nature to the poems, but even in the most intimate poems, there's always that structure of formality of a poem that's there. So it's important as a writer to kind of create that, so that we know as readers that every poem isn't, in Plath's case, a suicide note. Every poem is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every poem has that. There are two, she says in the third full paragraph on 79. I do suggest that there are two very possible consequences of this knowable person behind the poem. It may well be that the sense of the poet, previously a rather mysterious and removed figure, as an ordinary knowable person, has encouraged so many people to hope that they too can write poems. This new concept of the poet is invitational, and the spirit of our times is participatory after all. That might be even more so. Since she wrote this a few decades ago, we probably are even more in a participatory society now, where everybody feels that they can do it. I have so many students who talk about their desire to write poetry and the poetry they've written, not just in poetry workshops, but often in my 1010 classes. I think that's cool. I'm glad people feel like they can write poems. I'm glad you're here so we can try to write poems in a way that is a little more formal, a little more structured, a little more knowing. But I'm excited that people feel like they have a desire and ability to write this stuff. I think that's wonderful. She also says that she has wondered if the availability of the poem format, the poem as a candid and revelatory document, wasn't a timely encouragement to people to speak out about their personal and community life, to reveal themselves, as it were. Speaking of women writers, African American writers, Native American writers, for example, whose poems are often eloquent and powerful disclosures of gender or ethnic truths. I don't mean that this is all there is to it by any means. Any innovation in a literary field must take fire from many sparks in the societal atmosphere, but it is curious and even a marvelous fact. Just at a time when these voices passionately wished to speak out, there was a poem style in terms of apparatus and mood that was suitable for the purpose, and so seemingly plain and simple that it could, and I believe did, encourage many people who would never have attempted more formal verse. And I think this is a really important point. She's talking about how this poem gave voice, this type of poem gave voice to groups that maybe wouldn't have been able to, or interested in writing things in a more formal way. I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's also true that it gives voice to people who maybe aren't necessarily in those situations, that maybe wouldn't have felt confident in writing a poem. If everything that we thought was a poem was just 100 lines of rhymed blank verse, who the heck is going to want to feel like, oh, I'm just going to try to write this? But when there's an accessibility, a personal nature, that level of intimacy that's there, it feels accessible. It feels doable. And so it's exciting that a lot of people try to do it. She next talks about negative capability. I don't know if you know the phrase negative capability, but it is something that John Keats came up with a very long time ago. And as she points out, he's still the one that talks about it the best. So we'll just use his terminology and his language. She says here that his idea was simply, but momentously, that the poet should be a kind of negative force, that only by remaining himself negative, or in some way empty, is the poet able to fill himself with an understanding of, or sympathy for, or empathy with the subject of his poem. And I apologize for his pronouns here. But here's where he, and I can use it there because this is about Keats, discusses it. It struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So, and then he talks about Coleridge a little more specifically. So, Keats elsewhere then, jumping down to the bottom of the page, writes of taking part in the life of the sparrow pecking at crumbs in his window. A poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence, he says in another letter, because he has no identity. He is continually in for and filling some other body. So negative capability means that the poet is sort of an empty vessel that is filling up something else. Keats was not bothered by categories of animate and inanimate we get at the top of 84. His friend Richard Woodhouse records that Keats claimed that he could conceive of a billiard ball that it may have a sense of delight from its own roundness, smoothness, and very volubility, and the rapidity of its motion. So what's being said there is that Keats was able to see the world in ways in which it could be given life without literally being given life, so that he could see a billiard ball, a pool ball, and think, oh, look how marvelous it must be to be this ball. That's the negative capability that's coming in. It is meaning that a poet can kind of move into the consciousness, as it were, and understand the consciousness of something that otherwise wouldn't have life. So that a poet is able to provide this sense of being for other things. Okay? This is interesting, right? It's the poem in any age is the vehicle that holds, then transfers from the page to the reader an absolutely essential quality of real feeling. That negative capability is about creating feeling within the poem. And this is something that Keats was obsessed with, and he identified in a way that, as she said, is so up to date that it hurts a little. That it's about creating feeling, that we could take something that might not have agency on its own and give it to it and give it feeling and make the reader feel that. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, talk to me. But I think that it ultimately is a pretty clear thing that we're talking about the potential feeling that is possible and in some cases inherent within a given part of a poem. She then talks to us about different types of poems. And we start off with the lyric poem. And she calls it the most popular type of poem today, and I think this is still probably true, is a brief lyric poem. By fairly brief, I mean 60 lines or so, probably shorter than that. A glance into any current anthology will quickly show how many poems of this type and length are being written, compared with poems of great length or extreme brevity. So this is a style that became more in fashion, I think, in the 20th century and still carries on today. The lyric poem, here's her definition, is a brief, concentrated poem that has usually no more than a single subject in focus and no more than a single voice, and is more likely to employ a simple and natural rather than an intricate or composed musicality. It is not unlike, she says, a simple coiled spring waiting to release its energy in a few clear phrases. I'm going to read a poem by Li Young Lee. I'll post this poem below so you can follow along. I'll read it twice. The first time I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Then the second time, if you want to get a copy of it, you can follow along. Like I said, there's an attachment below. It's called Eating Together by Li Young Lee. In the steamer is the trout, seasoned with slivers of ginger, 2 sprigs of green onion, and sesame oil. We shall eat it with rice for lunch. Brothers, sister, my mother, who will taste the sweetest meat of the head, holding it between her fingers deftly, the way my father did weeks ago. Then he lay down to sleep like a snow-covered road winding through pines older than him, without any travelers, and lonely for no one. So, let's read it again. This time you can follow along if you didn't the first time. Eating Together. In the steamer is the trout seasoned with slivers of ginger, 2 sprigs of green onion, and sesame oil. We shall eat it with rice for lunch. Brothers, sister, my mother, who will taste the sweetest meat of the head, holding it between her fingers, deftly, the way my father did weeks ago. Then he lay down to sleep like a snow-covered road, winding through pines older than him, without any travelers, and lonely for no one. So do you see how that fits into the definition of the lyric? It's brief, it's concentrated, has no more than a single subject in focus, and we get the image of the father at the end, but we're staying really focused on the lunch that we get in the first place, and that's where the image kind of takes us most until it kind of moves on by comparing the mother to the father. It's likely to employ a simple and natural rather than intricate or composed musicality. Would we say that's a simple example of language? I think it is. I think so. A simple coiled spring waiting to release its energy in a few clear phrases. I think that's accurate here. It pops. It jumps. I don't know exactly where it's going, but there's a tension and tightness, even though the language is familiar and comfortable. The next poem that she discusses here is the narrative poem. It's generally longer than the lyric, and its tone is without such a tightly coiled force. It's discursive. It pauses at moments for humor and slowly unfolds description. It sets an easy and readable pace and helps us to enjoy sequential events. At times in the lyric poem, we are feeling like we're in a vortex. When we listen to the narrative poem, we are comfortable, engaged at times in trance. We could listen for hours. We do not love anything more deeply than we love a story. And narrative is at the center of all literature. So this is a type of poem that kind of winds and meanders a little bit more. Even when the narrative poem is relatively short, there's just a change in things because the language sort of moves and slides around a little bit more. As it says, there's pauses, there's humanity in terms of like the style of language, humor, things like that. Poets that come to mind for this include, right away I think of Campbell McGrath, who had some pretty interesting, long, winding poems that did many of the things we're talking about here. And obviously there are classic examples too, Keats, Robert Penn Warren. these are longer poems that tell stories. So this is a poem that tells a story. Now, I know that we could say that Eating Together tells a story, because it does. But this is a narrative poem in which there's a longer kind of winding that's going on. There are poems that can combine the lyric with the narrative, that you can have a longer form that sort of tells a story while keeping things very personal. Frank Bidart does a lot of this, kind of inspired by the work of Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath, as we've talked about before. But I think it's important to remember that this one is longer and more story-based in terms of telling a full story. The longer poem, nobody writes epic poems now, though they could. Come on, get on it. But poets do write long poems, ambitious poems, with a central idea, digressions, and often different voices. Generally speaking, such poems contain many different kinds of writing, according to the subject of the passage and the author's inclination. Such poems include many of the great works of our century: Patterson, Conquistador, Audubon, A Vision, The Bridge, The Wasteland. Long poems are not necessarily epic poems. The epic poem feels like it has something, she says, dignified theme, organic unity, orderly progress of action, like the Beowulf and Odyssey. Long poems don't have to be that, but there is a sense of formality that comes from the epic that doesn't necessarily be there. But remember, the narrative poem often, the work of Sharon Olds kind of gets picked on for this too. It doesn't always feel like poetic language. But it's telling a story, and it's most concerned with that. The longer poem can do whatever it wants. It just does it, well, longer. Prose poem, she talks about, we've already done that. We've already gotten into that a little bit. She also then talks about inappropriate language. These are things we probably shouldn't do. And I think it's kind of interesting to walk through things we shouldn't do. And as we've talked about before, you should never do blank unless you do and it works. But I think in a lot of times the things that she's going to talk about here are probably things we should be careful of. The first one she discusses here is poetic diction. This is language in which all freshness is gone, the edge is off, that it feels like it's trying to be a poet. Right? Instead of just writing what feels right, writing what's organic, writing what works for the poem in the moment, I'm trying to sound like a poem. And that often does not work. Right? She describes fields as emerald carpets, trees are druids or statesmen, and so forth. It is a collection, she says, of real clunkers. It's true. Language feels stale. It feels kind of hard to navigate. Sometimes it's best to be direct, to be comfortable. We avoid the cliche. We've talked about that a little bit. Inversion, changing the normal word order, is usually thought of as a bad thing. It isn't. You know, we can change words around and it's fine. But if we're doing it just to sound like a poem, then we've got a little bit of a problem. The same thing with informational language. If you're just having to give me a bunch of backstory to understand something, that's not going to work. If you're having to explain something because you don't think your reader can understand the poem otherwise, that creates language that is artificial, uninteresting, uncompelling. The language in a poem should have that sense of urgency. That doesn't. So you want to make sure that you've got a sense of language that matters, that has an urgency, and isn't just there to make sure I can read another part of the poem. Don't do that. Appropriate language is good syntax. She wants good grammar, forceful, graceful syntax to give the poem a vigor that it just has to have. So there's something that is appealing when it has to be about a poem that is following the rules, except when it isn't, and we've talked about that in class. Variety versus habits. We want to make sure that a poem is surprising, that you vary up what you're doing. You don't want to just feel like you're following into the same traps all the time. And the simple or the complicated. I like this one here. From time to time, I have heard students complain that the advice of their elders is always the same, that they should write simply, freshly, clearly. While at the same time, many of the poems used as models are highly organized, complicated, and difficult. This is true. The reasoning is as follows. A beginning writer should learn to construct a poem simply, freshly, and clearly. And then the beginning writer will no longer be a beginning writer and can go on and do more complicated, highly organized, and difficult work. So I want you to do difficult work, but I want to make sure that we know how. And it's not easy. I know most of the early work that I did was pretty straightforward lyric. And sometimes I play with forms that are longer and more complicated now. That's fine. And, it's just a matter of figuring out what's right for you at the given moment. And I don't think it's a bad thing to try to step out from beyond maybe where you are at a given moment to try something new. But be wary. It's the same advice I often have to give writing students. If it feels like they're spending too much time trying to write super complicated sentences, where at the stage they're at, they should be more straightforward with what they're doing. I want you to write things that are what you want to write at the moment. And sometimes keeping it simple will help us at this stage, because then we'll be able to be more complicated later. And I think that makes sense. We're not going to go into as much detail with the Kuser books this time, but I want to talk a little bit about writing about our feelings. We just talked about how the lyric poem is a valuable form because it allows us to feel an intimacy with a writer. It allows us to feel connected to the work of a writer because there's that sense of intimacy and vulnerability within the work. I think that's spot on, absolutely accurate, and something that is incredibly essential for us. But then the question becomes, well, what does it mean to write about our feelings? How do we do it? And is there a way to do it wrong? Yes. Yes, there is. There is a way to do it wrong. And early in the semester, I think we picked on Hallmark movies a little bit because sometimes the emotional way that they're getting things across is seemingly artificial. I'm not disrespecting Hallmark movies. I think they're probably aware of this and it's part of the charm. But when we're talking about a poem that's creating real emotional responses, what we need to do is make sure that we are letting our reader feel the emotional response that they're supposed to feel from a poem and not telling them what emotional response they are supposed to feel. On page 59 of Kuser, he talks about, on that first full paragraph after a little break, here's another way of thinking about expressions of feeling. A poem is an object constructed of words, and when this object is presented to its readers, it is theirs to respond to however they wish. By carefully selecting the detail, a poet can guide this response to some degree. This makes sense, right? This is why we can have a poem and one person can see something in the poem and one person can see something entirely different because they are making their own decisions on what the poem means to them personally. It's the same reason why we can all see a movie or read an article or do anything and have different responses. That's because we have different capacity for decision making. We have different experiences. We have different values. So that's why I can look at a poem and think one thing, and somebody else can look at the poem and feel something else. That's fine. It's good, in fact. But the reader can help guide this response, right? So I can create things to sort of lead the reader to a desired response. The problem with this in terms of feeling is if I lead the writer or the reader too much to a particular direction, then I'm not letting them make those decisions. And the feeling that they will get out of it will perhaps be artificial. Okay. For example, if into a scene a poet puts a blind child, the reader's response can be expected to be appropriate. Sentimentality can happen when a poet adds language, often as excessive modifiers, in an attempt to force a response, like that poor miserable blind child with his wee white cane. Right? So if you just introduce the character and describe the way the character looks in the cane, then the reader can make their own decisions on it. The reader's probably going to make the conclusion that you want the reader to make. But if we add all of this other language, especially as it says here with excessive modifiers, instead of saying the blind child with his small white cane, we get the poor miserable. This is the writer doing the feeling for the reader. And it's something that really is a problem, right? And it creates sentimentality, as we've talked about before. A poet can avoid sentimentality by giving the reader credit for knowing how to respond to something without being led by the nose. So we don't need to tell our reader what they're supposed to feel. If you've written a poem and you get it in workshop and you had a certain idea of what you wanted the reader to feel, and then in workshop you get like 5 different responses. Somebody was really happy and somebody else was sad and somebody was scared and somebody was angry. Then you need to relook at that poem. That maybe you didn't do enough to lead the poem in the desired direction that will lead to the expected response. But at the same time, if you grab the reader by the hand and run down the poem with them, then it's going to feel sentimental and artificial, and we don't want that. Okay. So, and then he provides the poem "The Fish" by Dixie Lee Partridge, and then after that, it says this line is one of, I think, the most important lines to think about in this section. One of the hardest things to learn is how poems can express strong feelings without expressly stating those feelings. You've read it. I've read it. I'm going to read it again. One of the hardest things to learn is how poems can express strong feelings without expressly stating those feelings. Why not? Why don't we want the poem to expressly state those feelings? What's wrong with that? Aren't poems supposed to be emotional, make us feel something? What is it that Kuzer's saying here? That we want the poem to express strong feelings without stating them? Why? Why don't we want to do that? Well, I think that what he's getting at, and I look forward to hearing your comments below, but I think what Kuzer's getting at is this idea that we're allowing the reader to make those conclusions. We're allowing the reader to understand on his or her own terms. We have confidence in the reader to get there. I don't need to say, I felt sad. Because if the poem's doing its job, the reader will know that I was sad. And it ends up feeling sentimental if it's obvious the direction in which I'm supposed to feel something. You know, there are obviously trigger things that just bring up our sentimentality alarms a little bit. If I've got poems about babies and puppies, then I kind of know this in the same way that if I see a baby or a puppy in a commercial on TV, oh, they're using pathos, right? They're using emotional techniques in order to try to make me feel something. We know these things. You know, poems about babies and children and puppies and kittens are making us feel a certain way. But you can also subvert those expectations, or at least allow the reader to earn those expectations by not telling them that I'm supposed to feel sad or feel happy or feel this. Let them feel. Let your reader figure out what he or she is supposed to feel. Don't tell us. I think that's a really important thing that Kuzer gets into with this. Obviously, we read a lot more in this section, especially about what our poems are supposed to do and look like, and the challenges we get when we get caught up in creating a poem that is supposed to be what a poem looks like. What I mean by that is this idea of does a poem end up having a specific feeling because we've caused it to have that feeling? Is it natural? Is it organic? Or am I forcing a form into a poem because it's what I've read elsewhere? In the section on writing from memory that begins on 73, he talks a little bit about how we use memories to create stories that will lead toward relatable and interesting reactions in the reader. Even if it ends up feeling kind of formula, there's still something that's natural about it. A lot of writers do it. We just saw it when I read the Lee Young Lee poem a few minutes ago. That's a poem about a memory, right? On page 83, there's that example that we're going to read in just a second, but the paragraph right before that, it isn't the lack of form, because there is a form to the everyday anecdotal poem. So this is what he's calling the anecdotal poem, is a poem that is providing a story that elicits a memory. Its form is a narrative sequence. Whenever Grandma peeled potatoes, she got out her paring knife and then ... And in nearly all the anecdotal poetry published today, you can count on, after a sequence of narrative particulars, a last-minute 1, 2, 3 heave-ho, as the poet attempts to generate some kind of special weight in the concluding lines. Remember Refrigerator 1957? I think he kind of does this a little bit, right? This happened first, and then this happened, then this, and then this happened next, and then this, and then, you won't believe it, this. So it's kind of building up to lead towards some sort of epiphany, some sort of, as it's being called here by Kuzer, 1, 2, 3 heave-ho moment, where there's like the big thing we get at the end. Now, this is just to say that there's nothing wrong necessarily with a format like this. Sometimes we write really interesting poems based on memories. We want poems to feel specific and direct and recollect important stuff. But you don't want it to end up feeling too trite or formulaic, right? So here's a poem on page 84 by Jane Hirschfield. It's called The Envoy. One day in that room, a small rat. 2 days later, a snake, who, seeing me enter, whipped the long stripe of his body under the bed, then curled like a docile house pet. I don't know how either came or left. Later, the flashlight found nothing. For a year, I watched as something, terror, happiness, grief, entered and then left my body, not knowing how it came in, not knowing how it went out. It hung where words could not reach it. It slept where light could not go. Its scent was neither snake nor rat, nor sensualist or aesthetic. There are openings in our lives of which we know nothing. Through them, the belled herds travel at will. long-legged and thirsty, covered with foreign dust. So, this is a poem, as Kuser says. Poems like this one by Hirschfeld use the anecdote as a substructure for deep and meaningful writing. And in such instance, the poet is not the slave but the master of the short narrative, using it in the same way a novelist might, as part of something greater. I find so tiring those thousands of poems in which the anecdote is wholly in charge, has seized control of the total effort, poems in which some personal story is fleshed out itself out in the guise of the poem and demonstrates no aspiration to be anything greater. A poem must be something more than an anecdote arranged in lines. Makes sense, right? So when we're recalling a story from our childhood or our earlier life or something that happened, the story itself can't be the poem. It can't. There has to be something that the poem is leading toward. We saw that in the Lee Young Lee poem that we read before, the Eating Together poem. We see that, I believe, in the Refrigerator poem, right? It's doing this, I saw this, I remember this, but then we get to this ending that has impact, that has this epiphany or this greater understanding. I think we certainly see it here in The Envoy by Hirschfeld, that it's leading us toward these unexpected turns. It's the anecdote that kind of gets us there. But this is how it often is, right? We're telling a story to a friend about something that happened, and maybe sometimes we stay on script and we just kind of keep it with what's going on, and we keep it to the story itself. But then times we start to veer toward what the story meant, what it mattered, what happened within the story that changed me, and why the story is worth telling, right? This is important. This is what matters. You don't have a story that just ends up being the entire poem. You've got to lead toward it. That's what a good lyric poem is. It's something that it has a personal connection, has a personal matter. Again, we don't just assume that the poet and the speaker are one and the same, but we can begin with that as the writer. And then I try to tell the reader, without telling the reader how to feel, what mattered about that story. Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Give me some feedback below about what you feel about some of the stuff we've talked about here. How do you deal with this idea of writing personal things in poems? And I don't know if I've talked to you about this, but maybe I have. But I was in grad school once, and I had a friend, still my friend, Dave. That sounds like I'm making Dave up, but Dave's real. I had this friend named Dave, and Dave told me after class once, he's like, why don't you write about things that matter? Why is everything about, writing poems about Nancy Drew or, whatever, all these pop culture things? Why don't you write about yourself? He said, you've got all kinds of crazy daddy issues and stuff. True. Why don't you write about that? And my instinct was, well, I don't want to. And the first thing I thought, and it was totally a defense mechanism, was nobody wants to read about that. Nobody cares about that. Of course people would potentially care about that, right? I care about things that the writer cares about if it's presented in an elegant and compelling enough way, right? And am I worried that people aren't going to relate to it? Well, because I have daddy issues and, I came from a divorced home and, I had to kind of find my own path earlier. I'm a Gen Xer. I think there are other Gen Xers in the world. Perhaps some of us have similar stories, right? No, I think what my concern was, it wasn't really that nobody was going to care. It wasn't really that maybe people would ignore my work. That wasn't it. That's the defense mechanism talking. What it really was is that I didn't want to write about those things. I was nervous for whatever reason writing about those things. I didn't want to talk about the challenges that I had as a kid and some of the issues that I had with my father or with others in my life. I didn't really want to write about those things. I was uncomfortable with it. But Dave kind of encouraged me. He said, you got to try it. You got to try to write these things. And then I tried and I hated it. I'll be very upfront. I didn't like it. I wasn't comfortable writing about stuff that was that personal. And then I figured some stuff out. Here's what I figured out. If I could take things that were personal and then also combine them with things that weren't real, then I could kind of hide behind a bit of a persona, a bit of a narrative within a poem that's telling a longer story. So I kind of started to combine things that were real with stuff that wasn't. And sometimes that got me into awkward situations, like the time a professor in a class told me that she didn't realize that something in a poem that felt very personal was real. And it wasn't. The poem itself was filled with things that were very personal, but I was also doing these other things to expand the narrative of the poem, expand the persona. And so I put in some things that were less honest, I guess. And she reached out to me about that, and I had to tell her, well, that wasn't entirely true. And then I felt like I was lying to her, and I'm not, right? Poems, creative writing in general, maybe creative nonfiction is in a different category than this, but there is an expectation that there's going to be an element of storytelling at work here that might not always have a truth, but it's still going to have a truth, right? So as I've gotten more comfortable with myself and with my writing, I think I do talk about things more autobiographically, perhaps, than I once did. But even still, there are always these levels of kind of hiding behind things to soften that. And I encourage it. If you're somebody who is apprehensive about writing about themselves, well, for one, maybe take a creative nonfiction class. That's probably going to help. And we have great people teaching that here. But also I think there's going to be the idea of trying to figure out what it is that you want to say in your work. And when I was first writing poems, I was happy being funny and a little bit goofy at times. I still am. I'm desperate to have people like me when I'm reading my poems in front of them. So I want to make sure that I have things that are accessible. But at the same time, there are larger stories to tell. And some of the things that I'm working on that are more recent, I've got a lot of stuff that's pretty personal that's in there. I want you to write what you want to write. And if that ends up being things that are more confessional and more personal in their lyricism or whatever we've got, let's do it. So let's leave it there. Obviously, I didn't get through everything in the Kuser book, but if you have any thoughts, any questions about any of the stuff, please add your feedback. It's kind of weird to do these lectures because our class is so conversation-based that I am so used to hearing direct responses from people over the course of the time we go. But we can do the next best thing, which is listen to me talk for 45 minutes and then giving me responses, and I can try to do my best to get through it. So thank you for listening. Make sure that you are providing me with a date for your next workshop if you have not already done a workshop in the next few weeks. I think we can get 4 in. We're a little meandering at times in our workshops, but I think we can tighten them up as we go. And then we'll just move from there. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week. I will start getting workshop poems posted for you to go over and prepare for workshop. Enjoy your week, and I look forward to talking to you on Canvas. Thanks.